It was a cold, windy evening when Alice found herself walking down an unfamiliar road. She had taken this path many times before, but tonight, something felt different. The sun had set quickly, and a thick fog began to creep across the city. The streetlights flickered, casting long, eerie shadows along the sidewalk. Alice had gone to visit a friend earlier that day. They had spent the afternoon laughing, drinking tea, and catching up on life. But now it was late, and Alice had to make her way home. Usually, she didn't mind walking through the city, but tonight felt different, strange, as if the night itself was hiding something. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she pulled it out. The message was from her friend. Asterisk, hope you made it home safely. Be careful. It's getting foggy outside. Alice smiled. Her friend always worried too much. But as she continued to walk, the streets became more and more unfamiliar. The buildings looked older, and the road twisted in ways she didn't remember. This doesn't seem right, she thought to herself. She stopped and looked around, trying to get her bearings. She opened her phone's GPS, but the signal was weak, and the map wasn't loading. She stared at the screen, but the little blue that was supposed to show her location seemed stuck in place. Great, Alice muttered under her breath, lost in the middle of the night. Determined to find her way, she decided to keep walking, hoping to recognize a street name or a familiar landmark. But as she moved further into the misty night, the streets grew narrower and the buildings became taller, casting darker shadows on the road. The sounds of the city, the cars, the chatter, the occasional honking of horns had faded away. Now, all Alice could hear was the sound of her own footsteps and the soft rustling of the wind. Suddenly, Alice heard a noise behind her. It was faint at first, just a soft, repetitive sound. She turned quickly, but no one was there. Her heart began to race. It's just your imagination, she told herself, trying to remain calm. But the feeling of being watched began to creep into her mind. Pushing the thought aside, she continued forward. A few minutes later, she saw a faint light in the distance. It was a small shop, its sign barely visible through the fog. Relieved, she quickened her pace, hoping to ask someone for directions. The shop was small, old, and a bit run down, but the door was open and a soft, warm light spilled out onto the street. As Alice stepped inside, a small bell above the door jingled. The smell of old books and incense filled the air. Behind the counter stood an elderly man with silver hair and kind eyes. He smiled at her as she entered. "Good evening," he said in a gentle voice. "You look a little lost." Alice sighed in relief. "Yes, I think I took a wrong turn somewhere. Can you help me find my way back to the main road?" The man nodded thoughtfully. "Of course, but the roads around here can be tricky, especially at night." He paused for a moment, then added, "Sometimes, they don't lead where you think they will." Alice blinked, confused by his words. "What do you mean?" The man chuckled softly. "This part of the city is old. The streets have a way of changing, especially when the fog rolls in. People sometimes get turned around, find themselves in places they didn't expect." Alice shivered slightly. There was something unsettling about what he was saying, but his calm demeanor put her at ease. "So, how do I find my way home?" The man walked over to the window and peered out into the fog. "There's a path that will take you back," he said slowly, "but you have to be careful. You mustn't stray from it, no matter what you see or hear." Alice frowned. "Why?" The man turned back to her, his eyes serious now. "The night has its own rules. It can play tricks on you if you're not careful." Alice wasn't sure if the man was joking or if he really believed what he was saying, but something in his tone made her listen. "All right," she said. "Can you show me the way?" He nodded and reached into his pocket, pulling out a small silver key. "Take this," he said, handing it to her. "It will help you find your way." Alice stared at the key. "What's it for?" The man smiled again, but this time there was something mysterious in his expression. "You'll know when the time comes." Before Alice could ask more, the man pointed her toward a narrow alley beside the shop. "Follow that path. It will take you back to where you need to go. But remember, stay on the path and don't look back." Alice hesitated for a moment, then nodded and thanked the man. She stepped out of the shop, clutching the small key in her hand. The fog had thickened, making it hard to see more than a few feet in front of her. She looked back at the shop, but the door had already closed, and the light inside had disappeared. Taking a deep breath, she began walking down the alley. The walls on either side were tall and covered in ivy. The air was cold, and the fog seemed to press in on her from all sides. She kept her eyes forward, remembering the old man's warning, "Don't look back." For a while, everything was quiet. The only sound was the soft crunch of her footsteps on the cobblestone path. But soon, she began to hear something else. Faint whispers, like voices carried on the wind. They were soft at first, almost like a distant conversation. But as she walked, they grew louder. Alice tried to ignore them, but the voices seemed to be calling her name. "Alice!" They whispered. "Alice, come back." Her heart pounded in her chest, but she kept walking. "It's just the wind," she told herself. "It's just your imagination." But the whispers didn't stop. In fact, they seemed to be getting closer. Alice's breath came in short gasps as she stared at the strange new surroundings. How had this happened? Where was she? She looked down at the silver key in her hand, its surface cool against her skin. The old man's words echoed in her mind. "You'll know when the time comes." Taking a deep breath, Alice held the key tightly and stepped forward into the forest. The trees loomed high above her, their branches twisting like dark, skeletal fingers. The whispers had faded, but the feeling of being watched had returned, stronger than before. As she moved deeper into the woods, the fog began to thin, and in the distance, she saw a faint light, a warm, golden glow, just like the one from the old man's shop. Her heart lifted with hope. Maybe this was the way back. She walked toward the light, her steps careful and deliberate. The trees around her began to thin, and soon, she found herself standing in front of an old stone gate. Beyond it, she could see the familiar streets of her city, the fog slowly lifting to reveal the soft glow of the streetlights. Alice smiled in relief. She had made it back. With a deep breath, she walked through the gate and onto the familiar road. The fog had almost completely disappeared, and the night seemed calm again. She looked down at the silver key in her hand, now warm to the touch. "Thank you," she whispered softly, though she wasn't sure who she was thanking. The old man, the night, or something else entirely. As she walked home, the city felt different somehow. The streets were the same, the buildings unchanged, but Alice couldn't shake the feeling that she had wandered into a place few ever visit, a place where the rules of the night were different. But she was safe now, and as she reached her front door, she smiled to herself. She would never forget her journey through the night and the strange key that had guided her home.